Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Bryson, professor of philosophy and director of the Susan and James Wright Center for the Study of Computation and Just Communities, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's event and to introduce today's speaker. I'd like to begin by thanking Bill and Sally Newcomb for gifting Dartmouth with this new center and for naming it after two people beloved and admired by so many of us here at Dartmouth and elsewhere, the late President Jim Wright and Susan de Beauvoir's Wright, an inspirational leader and mentor here for the past 45 years, who I'm so pleased is joining us this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Christine Ellen and Casey Hess, manager and administrative assistant for the Wright Center, for their inestimable work planning this event. Today's talk will go till around 5:56, after which we'll have 15 or 20 minutes for discussion. It will end at 6:15, and there will be a reception outside at that point, to which you're all invited. It's a great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marianne Franks, who is the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor in Intellectual Property, Technology, and Civil Rights Law at the George Washington University Law School. She's an internationally renowned expert on the intersection of civil rights, free speech, and technology, and has also published influential work in the areas of family law, criminal procedure, First Amendment, and Second Amendment law. Prior to joining the GW faculty, Dr. Franks was the Michael R. Klein Distinguished Scholar Chair at the University of Miami School of Law, where she was also an affiliated faculty in the Department of Philosophy. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School, as well as a doctorate and master's degree from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. Franks is not only a brilliant scholar, but is also a tireless activist dedicated to protecting our civil rights. She is the president and legislative and tech policy director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating online abuse and discrimination. In 2013, she drafted the first model criminal statute on non-consensual pornography, which has served as a template for multiple state laws and for pending federal legislation. She also advises several major technology platforms on privacy, free expression, and safety issues. Although it wasn't until 2018, I think, that I met Professor Franks. I'd admired her work for several years, ever since I started working on how the internet was changing how we think of freedom of expression. And so when I decided in 2016 to solicit articles from leading scholars for a volume on free speech in the digital age, she and Daniel Citron, who spoke here last May, were the two people at the very top of the list. To my delight, they both accepted. And Dr. Franks wrote a wonderful chapter, Not Where Bodies Live, The Abstraction of Internet Expression, in which she argued persuasively against the aggressively anti-regulatory approach to the internet encoded in Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which gives online platforms broad immunity against liability for harmful actions of those who use their services. And she just spent an hour in a wonderful, engaging conversation with my students about that and a couple of other articles of hers. Her scholarship has appeared in numerous journals, including the Harvard Law Review, California Law Review, UCLA Law Review, and she has also published countless short essays, op-eds, and blog posts in popular venues, such as The Atlantic, Newsweek, The Guardian, and The New York Times. Her award-winning 2019 book, The Cult of the Constitution, Our Deadly Devotion to Guns and Free Speech, is a tour de force that has already transformed the way many of us think about the First and Second Amendments. In it, she argues that these two amendments to the Constitution have functioned not to guarantee the rights of all citizens, but rather to protect white male supremacy. Her powerful arguments are backed by considerable evidence and are presented in an accessible and engaging style. As a philosopher, I appreciate the analytical rigor with which she tackles problems that might have seemed to be intractable. As a lover of literature, I value her beautiful writing style. I eagerly await her second book, Fearless Speech, which is due to be published next year. Her talk this afternoon is entitled Selling Out Free Speech. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marianne Franks.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Susan. The The admiration is so very much mutual, and it's such an honor not just to be here, but to be read by someone like you. And so thank you so much for that really generous introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be here talking to you about this, unfortunately, maybe timely topic of selling out free speech. And I'm going to start with an event from a couple of years ago. So October 14th, 2021, the company that was known at the time as Facebook announced the creation of a video data set of, as it described it, unprecedented scale and diversity that would capture daily life activity around the world, more than 3,000 hours of video collected by participants who were wearing cameras as they went about their daily activities in the home, workplace, leisure activities, social settings, and commuting. The project is called Ego 4D. The ego part of this stands for the first person or egocentric perception. That is the focus of the project. And among other things, the plans that Facebook has for this data set, for this information, is to equip augmented reality glasses and virtual reality headsets with the capacity to seamlessly transcribe and recall audio and visual recordings of people around the user. When asked whether Facebook had implemented any consent or privacy safeguards around these capabilities, a spokesperson replied that the company, quote, expected that privacy safeguards would be introduced further down the line. This announcement came in the midst of revelations about the company's extensive knowledge about violent extremism, dangerous misinformation, sexual exploitation, facilitated on its own platform. There were multiple internal documents that were released by whistleblowers that illustrated how this breezy promotion of Ego 4D was really characteristic of Facebook's approach. That is to push new, untested, potentially dangerous products into the public and worry about the consequences later, if at all. While it may have been abandoned as an official motto, the move fast and break things still seems to be the accurate description of Facebook's philosophy. But it's particularly brazen of Facebook, which then renamed itself a few weeks later as Meta, to launch a project that makes it easier for people to record people around them, potentially without consent, so fast on the heels of multiple revelations about the company's really troubling privacy, security, and moderation practices. In particular, the fact that nude images of an alleged rape victim were viewed 56 million times without consent before being taken down on Facebook, simply because the man that she had accused of the crime and who had posted the images in response was a famous soccer player. This was the result of the company's so-called cross-check program, which took sort of elite users, high-profile users such as celebrities and politicians, and essentially gave them special treatment when they violated rules against things like the non-consensual posting of intimate imagery. This kind of behavior, this kind of announcement in the midst of all this scrutiny is not just a sign of callousness. It's also a sign of confidence. There's confidence that no matter what gets revealed about Meta's role in causing horrific harms to people or undermining democracy, it will face no real consequences. This is held true throughout revelations about the company's amplification of COVID disinformation, the endangerment of teens' mental health, the acceleration of dangerous conspiracy theories, the promotion of violently racist and sexist propaganda. Because the lesson that Meta, along with a lot of these other ad-based social media companies like Twitter and Google, the lesson they've learned every time that they're implicated in scandal is that the media attention is going to be intense for a while. They'll probably get called before Congress and have to answer some awkward questions. They might have to pay a fine, which they will easily be able to do. There'll be a lot of talk about how now is the time that we need to rein in the industry, and then business will go on as usual. As a Facebook communications official allegedly stated in regard to a different scandal that Facebook was implicated in, quote, "It will be a flash in the pan. Some legislators will get pissy, and then in a few weeks they will move on to something else. Meanwhile, we are printing money in the basement and we are fine." That's a quote. What accounts for the tech industry's continued confidence, even as its role in egregious harms has become undeniably clear? It is now public knowledge that social media other telecommunications platforms contribute to genocide, to suicide, to mass shootings, to international and domestic terrorism, to public health crises, insurrections, election interference, sexual exploitation, reputational ruin, psychological trauma, and misinformation on an unprecedented scale. And yet, the tech industry not only survives, but it thrives. While legislative efforts to regulate some of these companies have happened in the last few years, this has mostly happened outside of the United States, which is where most of these corporations are actually housed or based. In the United States, even as we've heard more criticism about big tech, there have actually been very little legislative efforts that have taken root to address any of these issues. Well, part of it's easy, right? Big tech is big business, and in the United States, the tendency seems to be that if you have the greater profits, then the more diminished your responsibility is. But the tech industry's ability to inflict so much injury with so much impunity is based on something more than just raw corporate power. Its success in many ways is actually based on obscuring, to some extent, the commercial nature of its enterprises. The key to the dominance of the internet and other social media platforms is the appeal to free. And it's an appeal to free in two significant senses. First, there is, of course, the sense in which people don't pay for Twitter or for Google or Facebook as such. You don't get a bill. You don't pay for these forms of information or communication or connection that they provide. Of course, as we now all know, the supposedly free services that are offered by the tech companies are actually really very lucrative. They allow them to extract vast amounts of data from users for profit. But perhaps even more importantly than the free in the sense of the free services, there is an additional and even more powerful sense of free, and this is particularly true of the user-generated content social media industry. And that sense of free is free speech. Social media platforms have created the impression that they are indispensable for, if not in some cases indistinguishable from, free speech. This is an example of what I have termed consumerist constitutionalism. This is the conflation of a commercial product with a constitutional right. And the usefulness of consumerist constitutionalism for corporate interests is manifold. First, think about the deep emotional attachment that Americans have to their constitutional rights. If you think about that attachment, how easy it is to be lucrative and to have a lucrative enterprise when your product is the one that you're telling people is the only way that they can exercise those rights. And that's particularly true if you are constantly telling the American public that they're in danger of losing those rights. At any moment now, they might lose those rights. And that the only way to avert the crisis of losing your constitutional rights is to buy more of this product. Because consumerist constitutional, I can't even say this word that I have created, consumerist constitutionalism leads individuals not only to acquire these products, but to identify with certain products and services that create what psychologists call an endowment effect. And that makes any interference with access to those products feel like an existential as well as a constitutional threat. The halo of constitutional rights has a tendency to help disguise corporate interests as noble principles, which sidesteps the kind of wariness that Americans might otherwise have with overtly commercial enterprises. And this disarming effect is reinforced and it is promoted by civil liberties organizations and groups, influential players that often echo some of the same claims as the industry does in the name of protecting constitutional rights. So consider for a moment the firearms successful conflation, the firearms industry's successful conflation of the Second Amendment with gun ownership. Gun manufacturers, as they work in tandem with organizations like the National Rifle Association, have been so successful in getting people to associate Second Amendment rights with guns, ownership, and purchases that every modern debate about firearms regulation, no matter how modest, inevitably becomes a debate over the Second Amendment. The minority of individuals who own the majority of firearms in America don't view guns as products. They view them as extensions of themselves and exercises of their constitutional rights. And in that kind of view, even the most modest public safety reforms are going to feel like an attack. When you think about the NRA's really famous assertion, which is also a baseless assertion, but the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, think about how much that is marketing gold for the firearms industry, because it's telling Americans that in order for you to really protect yourself, in order for you to actually exercise your Second Amendment rights, you have to buy this product, preferably buy a lot of this product and maybe some of the accessories. And the way that consumerist constitutionalism works in connection to social media and the First Amendment follows a lot of the same patterns. From the earliest days of the internet, tech developers invoked the First Amendment and free speech principles in their visions of cyberspace. Think about the early 90s. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, the American Civil Liberties Union, were proclaiming that the internet was going to be the true home of freedom of speech. Early legislative attempts to regulate some of the abuses on the internet were quickly struck down on First Amendment grounds. Modest efforts to address online abuses continue to be condemned as censorship, while billion-dollar tech companies fund research and scholarship that further boosts the link between freedom of expression and the use of commercial social media services. This very shop war and civil libertarian cliche about how the best answer to bad speech is good speech is really an echo of the NRA's More Guns mantra, and it is a gift to the corporations whose business model is extracting valuable data from the free labor of internet users. Marketplace of ideas is no longer merely a metaphor for free speech in America, but a grim reality. Speech commodified, commercialized, designed to benefit the most powerful members of society. The tech industry has been selling out free speech for years, with devastating consequences for both equality and democracy. So, starting with the domination of the free speech industry. As of September 2021, the 5 largest US companies by market capitalization were Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, and Facebook. And that year, these 5 companies constituted 20% of the stock market's total worth, which is a level that was not seen from a single industry in 70 years. The dominance of the tech industry extends far beyond mere economic markets, shaping how people work, how they vote, how they socialize, how they learn and communicate. Back in 2005, only 5% of Americans reported using social media. Today, that number is 72%. 7 in 10 Facebook users report that they use the platform every day. Nearly 6 in 10 users of Snapchat and Instagram report daily use of their services. TikTok already has a larger user base than Snapchat and draws in children and teens for even longer periods of time than YouTube does. So as the influence and the power of big tech, as it's sometimes referred to, has continued to expand, there have been calls across the political spectrum for reining in the industry. But despite these increasingly impassioned calls for reform, the profit and the power and the influence of these major companies has really not subsided. In 2021, Google, Apple, and Microsoft all enjoyed record-breaking profits. Facebook doubled its profits and reported its fastest growth in 5 years. Between 2017 and 2022, there were 31 congressional hearings on the tech industry, and yet no major legislation has been passed to address privacy violations, antitrust issues, extremism, or misinformation online. The tech industry's success here, unprecedented economic, political, cultural dominance, relies really in large part on its successfully disguised commodification of free speech. When techno-libertarians argued in the 1990s that cyberspace was the true home of free speech, this was an assertion that was wrapped in anti-regulatory sentiment. Stay away, government. Tech companies invoked these laissez-faire First Amendment principles as a way to justify their long-standing failure to address extremism and abuse. They elevated passivity into a virtue. John Perry Barlow, who wrote the very famous or infamous 1996 manifesto, The Declaration of the Independence in Cyberspace, very humble title. He's a co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. One of his quotes from that piece is, "All the sentiments and expressions of humanity, from the debasing to the angelic, are parts of a seamless whole. We cannot separate the air that chokes from the air upon which wings beat." He was also a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, if you can't tell. In 2012, the CEO at the time of Reddit, whose name was Zishan Wong, dismissed calls to remove a subreddit that was devoted to sexualized, surreptitious photographs of underage girls by explaining that the company, quote, stands for free speech. In 2014, Frederick Brennan, the creator of the site that was known at the time as 8chan, referred to pedophiliac content on his site as, quote, simply the cost of free speech. Newer social media sites like Gab and Parler, which are home to vast amounts of violent white male supremacist content, are explicit about their professed First Amendment ideals. Gab's terms of service mention the First Amendment no less than 8 times. Parler's community guidelines state that its mission is to create a social platform in the spirit of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the tech industry masks the corporate manipulation, the extraction, the exploitation of its speech through an increasingly wide range of free services, promoting connection, entertainment, convenience. But primarily, the commitment that tech companies have to free speech is as a source of free labor. When individuals post on social media sites, they may feel that they are engaging in freedom of expression, but billion-dollar corporations are mining that data to be used for marketing, advertising, and surveillance purposes, and they don't care about the content. Online speech for a long time has been filtered and arranged and promoted and altered and labeled in accordance with corporate interests. The objective is not the promotion of free speech. It is not the protection of the public interest. It is the harvesting of data for profit. Search engines, social media platforms create nothing. They amplify, they sort, they sell the speech of users who increasingly are unable to conceptualize a right of free speech that exists apart from the internet. These industry players operate, in the words of Astra Taylor, as commercial enterprises designed to maximize revenue, not to defend political expression, preserve our collective heritage, or facilitate creativity. The commodification of free speech is an essential element of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. And I'll quote her here. She describes that as a boundaryless form that ignores older distinctions between market and society, market and world, market and person. It's a profit-seeking form in which production is subordinated to extraction, as surveillance capitalists unilaterally claim control over human, societal, and political territories extending far beyond the conventional institutional terrain of the private firm or the market. More than that, the relentless pursuit of what is euphemistically called engagement or community or user-generated content places a premium on extremist content that disproportionately targets vulnerable populations for abuse and harassment, which endangers public welfare and undermines democracy. And this extremism has a decidedly political slant. Contrary to the oft-repeated claims by many conservative figures that social media is biased against conservatives, the algorithms of major social media sites, including Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, disproportionately amplify right-wing content. Meta has gone so far as to change Facebook's algorithm to reduce the visibility of left-leaning news sites, while allowing right-wing sites to skirt the company's fact-checking rules and publish untrustworthy content that harm the tech giant's relationship with advertisers. Internal Facebook research titled Carol's Journey to QAnon demonstrated how quickly Facebook's algorithm recommended extremist conspiracy theorists to an account set up for an imaginary woman with interests in Fox News and Sinclair Broadcasting. The day after the 2020 election, 10% of all political content posts viewed on Facebook in the United States falsely claimed that the vote was fraudulent. This lopsided political amplification of right-wing content on social media is all the more troubling because of the disproportionate incidence of right-wing violence. Since 2015, right-wing extremists have been involved in 267 plots or attacks and 91 fatalities, which is more than 4 times the number of plots and attacks associated with left-wing viewpoints. The list of deadly events that are announced or planned or live-streamed on social media is seemingly endless. 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that resulted in the murder of Heather Heyer, the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue mass shooting that killed 11, 2019 Christchurch massacre that killed 51, the 2019 El Paso mass shooting that killed 23, 22 mass shooting of black shoppers at a grocery store in Buffalo, 2022 Uvalde Elementary School massacre, and the January 6th insurrection. Abstract claims about the value of free speech obscures who actually tends to benefit from the proliferation of extremist speech. The claim that what is often referred to as hate speech speech that attacks vulnerable groups on the basis of their identity, that the claim that they must be or it must be allowed to freely proliferate has historically and overwhelmingly benefited a specific group, and those are people who are committed to white male supremacy. We think of a short history here, what is widely considered to be kind of the high watermark of First Amendment free speech case law. ACLU, 1978, successfully advocating for the right of the neo-Nazi Party of the United States to march through the town of Skokie, Illinois, whose population at the time was more than 50% Jewish and included many Holocaust survivors. In the march, these National Socialists wanted to wear Nazi-style uniforms. They wanted to display banners that were featuring swastikas. They wanted to carry placards that read, "Free speech for the white man." In the end, after they got permission to do so, that they have a First Amendment right to do so, the Skokie March never actually took place. It was called off for unexplained reasons by the group's leader. But reflecting on the significance of the case, in April 2017, the ACLU executive director at the time, Aria Nair, stated that in a country where free speech generally prevails, it is best to take hate speech in stride. Ignoring it sometimes works, as does overwhelming it with the peaceful expression of contrary views. It was just a few months after Nair's remarks in 2017 that the ACLU once again fought successfully for the right of white supremacists to hold a demonstration, and this time in Charlottesville, Virginia. Unlike the Skokie March, the Unite the Right rally did take place, and it was neither ignored nor was it overwhelmed by the peaceful expression of opposing views. The demonstrators, many of whom were armed, waved Confederate flags and swastikas. They chanted Nazi slogans, and they attacked counter-protesters. And by the time it was over, 3 people were dead, nearly 50 people had been injured, and the city had suffered millions of dollars in damage. White male supremacists using the Constitution to justify and promote violent rhetoric has a really long history in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan's Constitution, it's with a K, has included the promise to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States of America since 1921. The patriot movements that have flourished since the 1970s frequently claim the defense of America and the Constitution as their fundamental purpose. The influential founder of the paramilitary group Posse Comitatus, William Potter Gale, told his followers in a 1982 radio broadcast that they were, quote, either going to get back to the Constitution of the United States and your government, or officials are going to hang by the neck until they're dead. White nationalists were also among the earliest internet adopters. They quickly recognized the potential of decentralized and anonymized communication for increasing their numbers, disseminating propaganda, and planning attacks. One of the very first online bulletin board systems to go live was called the Aryan Liberty Net, founded by a KKK leader named Louis Beam in 1984. Beam boasted that he was able to make racist material that had been banned in Canada and European countries available on the US-based computer network. The New York Times reported in 1985 that the Aryan Liberty Net had, quote, established a computer-based network to link rightist groups and to disseminate a list of those who it says has betrayed their race. Those lists included the names, the telephone numbers, and addresses of individuals that the organization considered to be race traitors and informers. The group described itself as a pro-American, pro-white, anti-communist network of true believers who serve the one and only God, Jesus the Christ. An early message posted on the site proclaimed, quote, finally, we are all going to be linked together at one point in time. Imagine, if you will, all the great minds of the patriotic Christian movement linked together and joined into one computer. The tactics that are used by right-wing extremists today, doxing, trolling, coded memes, decentralized communication strategies to avoid detection and disruption, what Beam referred to as leaderless resistance, were developed decades ago on online bulletin boards like this. As journalist Adam Clark Estes writes, you can draw a line from the first neo-Nazi online bulletin boards to the online hate form Stormfront in the 1990s to the alt-right movement that helped Donald Trump rise to power in 2016. January 6, 2021, thousands of Trump supporters swarmed the Capitol with the express intention of subverting democracy through brute force. We know the details. The rioters attacked police officers with a fire extinguisher, dragged one officer down several steps and beat him with an American flag. They attempted to locate and assassinate the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. They constructed a gallows on Capitol grounds and called for the hanging of Vice President Mike Pence. They ransacked congressional offices, they looted federal property, they forced terrified elected officials and their staff into hiding for hours. 4 people died during the riot. 5 law enforcement officers who responded to the event died in the days and the weeks following. As is often the case with acts of coordinated brutality, the January 6th insurrection has many fathers. They include, of course, the extremists who actually physically carried out the attack. But they also include the political figures who encouraged or excused the attack, the intelligence community that failed to warn or protect against it, and the online platforms that allowed them to promote it and to plan it. And all of these entities invoked free speech as a defense for their actions or their inaction. Several of the insurrection's organizers and leaders belonged to the far-right militia group, the Oath Keepers, who pledged not to obey any orders which infringe upon the right of the people to free speech. The group's founder, Yale Law School graduate Stuart Rose, described the organization's activities as pushing the First Amendment to its absolute limit. A Department of Homeland Security official testified in the January 6th investigation that federal authorities failed to provide a threat assessment of online activity that was advocating violence against government personnel and property in the lead up to January 6th because they regarded it as First Amendment protected speech. And even after the extent of the carnage became clear, members of the Republican National Committee defended the insurrection as, quote, legitimate political discourse. Social media companies cited free speech principles as they resisted calls to intervene against the extremism and the election lies that proliferated in the days that led up to January 6th. The argument here, of course, is not that the tech industry has created white supremacist violence, but it has accelerated it and it has promoted it for its own ends. True religion of any corporation is profit, not politics, but indifference to the destruction that could be wrought by ruthless pursuit of self-interest is the very definition of recklessness. In the colonization and the commodification of free speech, the tech industry unites corporate recklessness with individual recklessness. But the January 6th insurrection was enough of a shock to the American system that some things changed a little bit in the aftermath. Several tech companies made extremely belated and extremely modest attempts to do something after the insurrection had happened. By far the most controversial steps were the social media bans of then President Trump and some of his high-profile supporters. So in the days following the attack, Twitter permanently banned Trump's personal account, citing concerns for public safety. Facebook announced that it was going to suspend his account indefinitely. Google and Apple removed the right-wing dominated social media site Parler from their app stores after it refused to moderate violent content, and Amazon removed it as well. To put it very mildly, these measures were too little and too late. The damage had been done, and plenty of violent content remained up on various sites despite these restrictions. And yet, when these efforts were criticized, and they were criticized, the criticism was not that these modest measures were too little, it was that they were too much, that they were, in fact, censorship. Across the political spectrum, prominent figures condemned these belated restrictions as dangerous forms of censorship. These included, on the right, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who posted that silencing speech is dangerous, it's un-American. Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, free speech is under attack, censorship is happening like never before, don't let them silence us. Congressman Matt Gaetz, Florida, proclaimed on Twitter, we cannot live in a world where Twitter's terms of service are more important than the terms in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. The White House press secretary at the time, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, tweeted on January 9th, first she complained about the fact that she had lost 50,000 followers. The radical left and their big tech allies, she said, cannot marginalize, censor, or silence the American people. But on the left, Facebook's indefinite suspension of Trump's account was met with reactions like that of whistleblower Edward Snowden, who tweeted, Facebook officially silences the President of the United States. For better or worse, this will be remembered as a turning point in the battle for control over digital speech. The Electronic Frontier Foundation somberly observed that, quote, we are always concerned when platforms take on the role of censors. A senior legislative counsel for the ACLU opined that it should concern everyone that companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that have become indispensable for the speech of billions. It is truly a testament to the power of consumerist constitutionalism that when the biggest backlash against the tech industry came, it was not over the company's role in causing and contributing to actual harm for profit, but over a handful of belated, minor, scattershot decisions to mitigate a tiny, tiny fraction of those harms. And the highly personal sense of grievance that permeated this outrage following these steps really helped make clear the degree to which Americans have come to view posting on social media as an activity to which they have a proprietary constitutional entitlement. Consider, for instance, that in 2019, there was a Freedom Forum Institute survey that found that more than half of all respondents, 65%, believe that social media companies violate users' First Amendment rights when they ban users based on the content of their posts. More than half. This belief, as anyone who has studied the First Amendment knows, is completely wrong. There are lots of aspects of the First Amendment that are very ambiguous and very confusing and very complicated. This one is not, the so-called state action doctrine. Very few exceptions. The First Amendment, like the rest of the Bill of Rights, restrains the government. It does not restrain private actors. More precisely, the First Amendment requires the government to be broadly tolerant of speech. This is true, but creates no such obligation on the part of private actors, including private tech companies. The Supreme Court has referred to the state action doctrine and leaving the idea that this is limited to the government. The government is restricted. Private actors are not restricted. The way the Supreme Court has described this is as protecting a robust sphere of individual liberty. Now, what does that mean? It means that the First Amendment protects the freedom of private actors to ignore speech, to exclude it, to criticize it, to refuse to associate with it. Every person is entitled to walk away from an unwanted conversation, to close the door on an uninvited guest, to ignore an unsolicited email. The First Amendment right to free speech for private actors is also the right not to speak. It is the right not to engage with speech and to not associate with speech against our will. Tech companies are private actors. They have all of those same rights. And to call any of those things censorship is, to use an overused word, Orwellian. When social media platforms ban users or they remove content, they are exercising their own First Amendment rights. They are not violating someone else's. So the question is, why do so many Americans misunderstand this? Why do we characterize the free speech rights of private actors as censorship? And one answer is the ubiquity of technology in our lives, the outsized influence of the internet over our daily lives makes us feel like these online platforms and tech companies aren't the premises and the products of corporations, which they are, but they feel like public forums that are controlled by quasi-governmental actors. That's the feeling. Modern society is very dependent upon the tech industry for communication, for news, for commerce, for education, for entertainment, such that any restriction of that access feels like a matter of constitutional significance. And perhaps most importantly, this is the kind of fantasy, this is the myth that the tech industry itself has been promoting. Social media activity being synonymous with free speech, the tech industry has actively encouraged the public to think of online platforms as natural, as somehow essential, unmediated outlets for free speech. And this is why one of the most telling things about the hearings in which representatives from those companies were called again before Congress this time to account for, why are you censoring? How dare you take Donald Trump off your platform? What were the companies' responses? They apologized. They hedged, they promised to do better, but they avoided providing the obvious answer, which is, well, we did it because it's well within our First Amendment rights to do so. That is what we were doing. We were exercising the First Amendment. We were not engaging in censorship. Why would they not give this extremely obvious answer that has the added benefit of being true? And a valuable opportunity to educate the public about what the First Amendment does and doesn't do. And the answer I would submit lies in the fact that the tech industry itself has created this illusion about speech. It's cultivated that impression. However unpleasant it might be temporarily for these companies to be accused of censorship, it's ultimately in the industry's best interest to maintain the illusion that they are invested in all of your free speech rights rather than their own. Because that is, after all, the myth that allowed tech companies to pretend that their hands were tied all up until this point when it came to violent content in the first place. And it is this myth of private censorship being the worst thing that could possibly happen that will ensure that public opinion will be on their side when they return as they inevitably were going to do, to business as usual, which is usual practices of amplifying and monetizing harmful content in the guise of respecting free speech. And consider where we are today. Elon Musk has restored Trump's account. He did so in November 2022. Meta ended Trump's Facebook suspension in January 2023. And social media is back to being awash in conspiracy theories, violent rhetoric, and dangerous misinformation. The reason why the tech industry tolerates and sometimes even promotes the narrative that addressing foreseeable harms is censorship, and that this private censorship is as bad as, or maybe even worse than government censorship, is because it does ultimately reinforce the perception that social media engagement is the truest, most important form of free speech. Consider that calls to reform big tech, whether that comes from the right or from the left, take dependence on social media as a given and focus primarily on making it fairer. Calls for more transparency, enhanced due process protections, detailed explanations of content moderation policies, proof that these policies are being enforced consistently. All of this requires sinking more time, more energy, more attention to technology, and submitting to even greater technological domination over every aspect of our lives. This is why the companies scrape and bow and promise to do better, and sometimes even call for those forms of regulation themselves. So the backlash against big tech censorship largely reinforces the reduction of free speech to social media consumption. In addition, it creates contempt and suspicion for the First Amendment right of private actors to not be compelled to speak or to associate with speech against their will. The concept of private censorship, as I've said, is Orwellian. It is a claim that the First Amendment right not to listen somehow violates the First Amendment right to speak. And Orwellian claims lead to Orwellian solutions. If allowing private actors to make their own decisions about speech on their own platforms is censorship, then forbidding them from making those decisions must be free speech. This is the logic behind multiple high-profile lawsuits against Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others for alleged free speech violations. For the Trump-era executive orders that were aimed at curtailing what he called social media censorship, and, most chillingly, legislation in states such as Florida and Texas authorizing the government to force social media platforms to carry speech against their will. Indeed, in upholding Texas's law that does exactly this, the Fifth Circuit explicitly expressed contempt of the right of private companies to make decisions about what content to allow on their own platforms as censorship, and characterized the Texas law that forbade them for doing so as a vindication of free speech. So the backlash against big tech censorship denigrates the First Amendment rights of all private actors against compelled speech and forced association, which further reduces free speech to reckless consumerism and also has the effect of serving as a distraction from actual government censorship. At the very same time that Republican politicians were raging at big tech for entirely imaginary suppressions of certain ideas, right-wing content, they were spearheading massive censorship campaigns to eradicate historically accurate discussions of slavery, acknowledgement of systemic racism and sexism, drag shows, books that describe non-heterosexual intimate relationships, and diversity trainings. So much of the free speech censorship discourse revolves around these cliches that speech, bad speech, can be answered with good speech, that there is such a thing as a neutral platform, that protecting the speech of extremists and misogynists and bigots will trickle down to protecting the rights of other people. But the January 6th insurrection should have made clear about who actually benefits from the consumerist, reckless conception of free speech. Those, first of all, who forcibly want to revert this country to racial patriarchy, and the billion-dollar tech industry that will help them do it so long as it means that it will make them money. And the Zuckerbergs of the world may say, but we don't want that to happen, that they condemn violence and racism, the misogyny. They don't intend for their platforms to be used in these terrible ways for radicalization and massacres and sexual exploitation. It's that classic civil libertarian cliche, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Now, it's increasingly evident that some CEOs of influential tech platforms don't actually disapprove of white supremacy all that much, but the larger point is that the lack of approval of these companies is really not the point. Whether you are holding your nose or whether you are given a thumbs up, helping violent white male supremacy reach a wider audience is helping violent white male supremacy. especially if that happens to put money in your pocket. For almost every person in almost every industry, ignoring or profiting from foreseeable harmful conduct, even if you are not actively or intentionally engaged in it, creates the possibility of liability, as well it should. Think about people who drive recklessly can be prosecuted for causing accidents. They didn't mean to. They can still be prosecuted for causing accidents. Car manufacturers can face liability for producing engines that catch fire. Hospitals can be sued if a surgery is botched. Employers can be held liable if they fail to respond to reports of racial discrimination. News outlets can be sued for repeating defamatory claims. And while there's no general duty to aid in the United States, third parties can be held both criminally and civilly liable for their role in harmful acts that they did not cause but did not do enough to prevent. The potential for liability in situations like this encourages us to take care, to internalize risk, to prevent foreseeable harm. The legal definition of recklessness is defined as acting as a conscious disregard for the substantial and unjustified risk of harm to others. It's a mental state that's considered to be less culpable than actually intending to cause harm, but more culpable than mere negligence about something you should have known but you didn't know. Recklessness could really be described more as a product of selfishness than it is of malice. It is a risk calculation that values the benefit to oneself more than the potential of harm to others. The possibility of being held accountable for the negative consequences of those risks tends to serve as a really important restraint on the reckless pursuit of self-interest. And accordingly, the more remote the possibility that you will be held accountable for those consequences, the greater the risk that one will be willing to take. Economists call the perverse incentives that are created by the ability to offload the costs of risky behavior onto someone else, they call it a moral hazard. And it partly helps explain why the tech industry is allowed to move so fast and break so many things. Sweeping interpretation of a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is a moral hazard that ensures that the industry avoids responsibility for ever picking up the pieces. So here's a really quick history of Section 230. 1996, Congress attempted to regulate pornographic content on the internet by passing something called the Communications Decency Act, hence the name. But the Supreme Court pretty quickly invalidated almost every provision of that law, but there was one bipartisan provision that is now popularly known as Section 230 that remained. And in essence, it limits how and when online intermediaries, what the statute calls interactive computer services, things like Facebook and Twitter, how and when they can be held legally accountable for the actions of those who use their platforms and their services. And subject to a few exceptions for things like federal criminal law violations, intellectual property law, and sex trafficking, providers or users of an interactive computer service are not liable for the content created by other users. The operative section of Section 230 is titled Protection for Good Samaritan Blocking and Screening of Offensive Material. And the text of Section 230, if you read it, can actually be interpreted as providing immunity only when online intermediaries act like good Samaritans. That is to say, when you act in such a way that you have acted voluntarily to help someone that you didn't have a legal obligation to help. But most courts have not interpreted Section 230 that way. Instead, they have interpreted Section 230 to preemptively absolve online intermediaries of almost all state criminal liability and all tort liability for harms that are facilitated on their sites and services, even when they could have easily have chosen to prevent them and even when they profit from them. And this sweeping interpretation of Section 230 immunity virtually ensures, that the drive for profit will always exceed the drive to create healthier or safer products. Because as long as tech platforms are allowed to enjoy the benefits of doing business without having to absorb any of the costs, they will have little incentive to take care. Given that the dominant business model of social media services is based on advertising revenue, they have no natural incentive to discourage abusive or harmful conduct. Abusive posts bring in ad revenue. The more content that is posted, good or bad, the more ad money goes into their coffers. So far from providing incentives to remove harmful content, the way that Section 230 has been invoked by the tech industry and interpreted by courts provides incentives for intermediaries actually to leave up harmful content and even to actively promote it and seek it out. To give a few examples, Section 230 has been used to protect online classified sites from facing liability for sex trafficking ads, from online firearm sellers from facing liability for facilitating unlawful gun sales, to domestic abusers who went on to murder their estranged partners, online message boards like 8chan from facing liability for live streaming massacres and spreading terrorist propaganda, and online marketplaces from facing liability for putting defective products into the stream of commerce. The tech industry's continuing immunity from liability is a testament to the extraordinary degree to which lawmakers and the public continue to believe that when it comes to free speech, corporate interests somehow will align with constitutional ones. Back to the firearms analogy just for a moment. The closest analog to Section 230 and what it does for the tech industry is probably a federal law that does something very similar for the firearms industry, and that's called the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, also PLACA for short. It provides a super immunity for powerful corporations that encourage them to pursue profit without internalizing the costs of that pursuit. PLACA eliminates incentives for manufacturers, firearms manufacturers, to develop safer guns or secure storage. And in much the same way, Section 230 eliminates incentives for tech companies to design safer platforms or safer policies. Private individuals are left to their own devices to pick up the pieces for the things that are broken. The moral hazard that's created by Section 230 stifles the development of a duty of care for the tech industry. It eliminates the incentives for the best positioned party to develop responses to avoid foreseeable risks of harm. Section 230 has then played a central role in the dystopian state of affairs we're in now, where expressive economic and information inequalities divide our society, where the leader of a country can use social media platforms to incite violence against his own citizens, where domestic terrorists can coordinate bloody attacks on the Capitol, where global corporations can extract astronomical profits from exploiting private data, and where women and minorities are silenced by online mobs, and where massive disinformation and misinformation campaigns can micro-target populations to create public health crises, foment armed rebellions, and undermine democracy. There are a few things that we can do to try to exit from this dystopia. It's not all necessarily bad news. Now that the marketplace of ideas is no longer a mere metaphor, the fact that the American conception of free speech is dominated by giant corporations whose only real interest in speech is how to exploit it for profit, once we recognize that this is true, we can think about ways to reduce our reliance on the consumerist model of free speech. What that would require, and I'm happy to talk more in the discussion, is reforms, on the one hand, to Section 230 to reduce that kind of immunity for really reckless conduct. It would also require targeted legislation in some cases to address new and emerging crimes. It would also include the development of resources that will attempt to reduce the public's reliance on social media, corporate-owned social media, including, as one thought, the passage of robust consumer protection laws and regulations, as well as investment in public universities, traditional media, libraries, other non-social media avenues of expression and information. If we can imagine, if we were to move ourselves away from the reliance on the social media industry and the free speech industry, we could imagine that instead we would have multiple spaces, online and off, public and private, that were developed to provide the conditions necessary for free expression, democratic deliberation for different groups, different needs, and a democratic society can and should demand myriad possibilities of a free speech culture as opposed to the constraints of a free speech industry. 3:41 a.m., January 7th, 2021. In closing the joint session that finally and formally declared Joseph Biden to be the next president of the United States, the Senate chaplain, very black, led the legislative body in prayer. These tragedies, he said, have reminded us that words matter and that the power of life and death is in the tongue. The events of January 6th were a dramatic repudiation of First Amendment fundamentalist myths. The belief that truth will prevail in the marketplace of ideas, that the answer to bad speech is always more speech, that the best way to safeguard democracy is to remain passive in the face of lies, racism, misogyny, and calls to violence. A reckless, reductionist, consumerist conception of free speech that underpins those myths plays directly into the hands of those who view the Constitution as the charter for establishing white male supremacy. Justice Robert H. Jackson wrote in a 1949 dissenting opinion, with particular resonance for our time, "There are many appeals these days to liberty, often by those who are working for an opportunity to taunt democracy with its stupidity and furnishing them the weapons to destroy it." Justice Jackson quoted as one example the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, quoting him to say, "When democracy granted democratic methods for us in times of opposition, the Nazi seizure of power was bound to happen. We National Socialists never asserted that we represented a democratic point of view. We declared openly that we used democratic methods only in order to gain the power, and that, after assuming the power, we would deny to our adversaries without any consideration of the means which were granted to us in times of opposition." The First Amendment is frequently invoked as a reason to maintain the status quo for free speech and social media, but the First Amendment is intended to serve the values of truth, autonomy, democracy, all of which are jeopardized by an information ecosystem that is polluted and weaponized by extremists and dominated by the interests of corporations. The First Amendment should not be viewed as an obstacle to accountability for harm, carefully drawn legislative interventions, or other measures that are aimed at safeguarding democracy. Because the choice, as Justice Jackson reminds us, is not between order and liberty. It is between liberty with order and anarchy without either. Thank you, and I welcome your questions. Unmute the bottom one.
Thank you so much for that marvelous speech. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and there are 2 microphones set up in the aisles. So if you want to ask a question, please line up by the mic. This is being live streamed and recorded for later viewing, so it would be really great if you could ask your questions into the mics. Is that on? Christine? Oh. Wait, try it now. Oh,
Look at you.
So you mentioned how anonymous speech is really is a big problem in terms of soliciting a lot of hateful messages. But do you think that anonymous speech also can serve a role in allowing people to express unpopular opinions?
Yeah, so the question was about kind of the double-edged nature of anonymous speech, which I would say, yes, that's right. That what you get with the possibility for anonymous speech is both the capacity to maybe do more harm because you have less concern about the consequences of it coming back to you, but also in certain situations it provides space for political dissidents. It provides space for domestic violence victims. It provides space for any number of people who would need the protections of anonymity to be able to express themselves. So I think it is important to keep in mind that that is a complex and nuanced gift that the internet can give us, and then to still maintain at the same time that every liberty has a boundary, and if there are certain ways in which people have abused that liberty, that we should have the possibility of being able to call them into account.
Thank you.
I'm just going to pause for a minute because I know my many students have questions. They're hands up at the end of our hour, so feel free to jump in.
Hello, I am one of said students. I wanted to ask about your experiences in being in some of these rooms with the leadership of these big tech companies, and I guess especially we've seen in the past year an interesting sort of, and we have I guess always seen an interesting sort of prioritization of issues that these leaders and CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman are concerned with versus sort of, I guess, other issues in like the public sphere. And I was wondering, have you seen kind of have you seen a concern in this, or have you seen are there other issues that you see these leaders express sort of concerns with or focus on? Thinking about, for example, Elon Musk's discussions of needing to go to space instead of I don't know, have safety boards in Twitter. That,
Yes.
Yeah.
That one feels very personal because I was actually a member of, or my organization was a member of the Trust and Safety Council that Musk disbanded sort of abruptly on one day. But thank you for that question. One of the things I think about, or I think is worth emphasizing, is that for the last decade or so that I've been at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and we've been part of some of these conversations with tech companies, is that I don't want to suggest that these companies are monoliths, right? The reason why we're in the room some of the times to have conversations about abuses and the best way to handle them is because some people at these companies care deeply about harm. Some of these companies, some of these individuals at these companies care deeply about doing the right thing. And so it was always a complicated experience of choosing to serve on these councils because we knew that in some extent we were kind of playing at the margins of something that was never actually going to get much better, that really couldn't maybe redeemed. It could only really be tinkered with. But at the same time, those individuals were really sincerely trying to make those companies better, and I think they did. I think there were lots of improvements that we saw in the last decade or so. But to your question about, what are the concerns of some of these companies when you get to the really high decision-making ranks, right? So if you look at the diversity in, let's say, employment when it comes to the tech industry, it's pretty bad, right? It's pretty bad across the board, but when you go up the chain in terms of who makes the decisions, it's really bad. It is overwhelmingly white, it is overwhelmingly male, and it's also disproportionately Asian, but it's a small subset of the population that's making those calls. Whereas trust and safety teams tend to be really small, they tend to be female-dominated, and they tend not to have many resources or much power. And so when you hear things like what happened when one of the first scandals with Facebook, that Mark Zuckerberg, following someone who had he had not exactly live streamed his murder, but he live streamed talking about the murder he had just committed. Zuckerberg gives this talk where he says, "We had no idea that Facebook Live could be used for such a thing." And you have to wonder at this point, is he being sincere, right? That is, he really has no idea, then he shouldn't have that job, one. But then the other response is, no, you did know and you just didn't care, right? So the answer at this point can't be that these companies keep saying, oh, we just didn't know this was going to happen, because of course they knew it was going to happen. And if they don't know, they don't have the right people in the room to ask those questions, right? The perspective that I've sometimes referred to by borrowing from the human rights context, you may have heard of the concept of the last girl. The concept of the last girl being that you should take an account of policies and practices. The way you should assess them for justice is to think of the most vulnerable person in society and how that policy or practice will affect her. And it's usually, in many places, it's a girl. And so imagining what will be done for or against this person, this really vulnerable person with these kinds of vulnerabilities with this policy. And so advocating for these companies to take that kind of perspective as opposed to replicating their own concerns like going to space or whether or not their private jet is being tracked.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, how do you think the Supreme Court will rule in Missouri versus Biden?
Oh, I don't know. That is such a good question. I want to recognize how good that question is, because that's one of these really complicated cases about this almost upside down world that we're in now, about this idea that a government official even speaking to Twitter or saying something about policy violations is somehow itself colluding with those private companies. It's really hard to tell at this point because of the politicization and the way that the First Amendment is being kind of invoked in really contrary ways. But I appreciate the question because I think it is really interesting to see how now we're in a political moment where it seems advantageous for certain groups to say anytime a government official even says anything to a social media platform, that in itself becomes government action. We've never had that view of state action before. And if we were using that kind of rule in terms of public officials who are currently serving office making threats or suggesting that bad things will happen to you if you don't do X or Y, then there are certainly things that happened during the Trump administration that we should be taking a much closer look at, right? But yes, it seems to be a very highly motivated political shell game about trying to say, well, conversations between these two, between government officials and social media companies, which I do want to say one thing about it, which is that one would hope that government officials, just like any member of the public, would be allowed to alert Twitter or alert Facebook if they thought something on the site was violative of the policies, and that a rule that would suggest otherwise is pretty scary. Thanks.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming in to speak and coming into our class. We really enjoyed it. My question is regarding freedom of speech. You said that it's both constitutional and cultural. And you mentioned in the end of your talk about the different reforms that would address the constitutional aspect of it, like changing Section 230 and creating targeted legislation. But how would you propose that we would approach changing this cultural norm of understanding social media platforms as being a place where social media is speech?
Yeah, it's the harder question in some ways. I mean, they're both really hard. I don't want to oversimplify the legal question, which will be its own kind of battle, but this cultural attachment, right, that is so successful. And I don't mean to suggest that I'm not sympathetic to it, because we're all trapped in it, right? Because it becomes sort of the air that you breathe, this idea that if you have an opinion or you have something to say, well, that it doesn't exist until you put it somewhere on social media. How do we get past that? Well, I only have partial answers to get there, but I sometimes say to my First Amendment seminar class, I ask them, when's the last time you had a really good conversation? And I let them tell me what a good conversation is like. And most of the time, they'll end up telling me that it's a conversation where all the participants were able to speak freely with each other without feeling that they were going to be taken the wrong way or taken out of context, and that they learned something from each other and there was a genuine exchange of ideas. And they never say that they had that conversation on Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat. Or they say they had that conversation with their roommate. They say, I had this really interesting conversation with my mom randomly, or I had a conversation in this class. And then I try to back up and I say, so why don't we think about those situations as being our free speech moments, right? Because if they are where speech is happening and where real ideas are being exchanged, why don't we promote those as the models, right? Let's not use the internet as a model for freedom of expression and the exchange of ideas. Let's use something like the classroom, if it's a good classroom. Let's use the European salon, right, where people were invited to talk about art and history and philosophy together in a safe space, right? So I think that's kind of where we have to start, is to remember that we do have conversations and we do express ourselves in lots of different ways outside of social media, and that in many ways those are some of the most meaningful interactions we have.
Hello, thank you for the speech. So my question is, how exactly should companies regulate harmful content on their platforms? And more specifically, should it be a human, or should it be computer or AI?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and one that I am going to not answer, because in part because one of the things that I really try to emphasize in my work is not so much about regulating content. So I think that that's very much the name of the game often is, well, let's regulate content. Let's try to get rid of some of the bad speech. And I have to confess that I'm less interested in that as a project. So I'm not really worried. I don't love the fact that we have a situation where social media is overwhelmed by really uncivil and unpleasant discourse, most of which is really false or bad. I don't love that, but that doesn't seem like the major problem. The major problem is not a general sense of what's out there. The major problem to me seems to be the causation between certain forms of speech, radicalization, extremism, attacks on individuals that result in offline harm, and the fact that when that happens, individuals who are harmed are not able to sue those companies for the role that they played, or to even find out how much of a role those companies did play in that kind of harm. So I would say my emphasis is much more on trying to make sure that people get in that courtroom door to litigate. That is a kind of a regulation through litigation kind of strategy, and less about a general sense of how do we regulate the bad stuff that's out there.
So first off, I have to give a shout out to Professor Rockmore in our Free Speech Writing 5 class. So my question is relating to the march on Soke. What do you think, in your opinion, is the best way where we can preserve freedom of speech while also preventing events like that from happening?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I mean, I think oftentimes about what I think the right decision would have been in that case, right? So if you look at the decision, that there's the Seventh Circuit decision, there's a Supreme Court decision, and basically it resolves in this way that I find really troubling, which is the court, what happens in this case is that the Nazis they basically announce that they want to march in Skokie, and Skokie passes a bunch of ordinance saying, no, you can't wear SS uniforms, and you can't have swastikas, and you can't terrorize this population. And the court's reviewing this to say, this is represented by the ACLU, they say, well, that's all speech. And what you're trying to do, Skokie, is you're just trying to regulate offensive speech. And the best thing that you could really do is ignore it, right? Or show up and say bad things to the Nazis. Right? And they actually make a comparison between this and a very famous case, the Cohen versus California case, which some of you may know, I hope I'm allowed to curse, but the fuck the draft case, right? Where when Cohen gets in trouble for wearing having this profanity on the back of his jacket, the court says one man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. We can't try to regulate this kind of taste. The court in Skokie says this is basically the same. The swastika is basically like that jacket. And that's at the point that I think the court's got this absolutely wrong. It's not like that jacket, right? That jacket may be offensive, it may be profane, but it's not targeted at anyone, and it does not have a historical context that literally invokes extermination, right? The feeling of the experts that were testifying on behalf of the Skokie ordinance were saying, when neo-Nazis show up in a town that is got this many Holocaust survivors in it, and they want to wear SS uniforms, and they want to wear swastikas, they are saying to those people, we didn't get you yet, but we're coming for you now. That is what that speech is. It is not like offensive speech. Offensiveness is not even the beginning. So what I wish is that the court had actually understood that those two things are not the same. You can decide that there are certain forms of profanity or things that we don't like or things that we just consider vulgar, yes. But there's a difference between that and speech that actually causes harm and threatens people.
Yeah, go ahead. We have time for one more question.
I just have a question regarding the legality of if we were to impose a kind of moderation standard to kind of resolve some of the problems with Section 203. How would that work jurisdictionally? So if we were to impose a standard that would, kind of preclude all U.S. citizens from making harmful speech, a lot of these forums in which people post content are internationally dispersed, and I was wondering if they would be filtered out, or how would that apply? How would that exist?
Well, I do want to make clear in the first instance that I wouldn't support regulation that says people can't say X, right? Whether that's based in the U.S. or anywhere else. I am not a supporter of regulations that purport to say there are certain acceptable things or non-acceptable things before the fact. I think it has to be a fact-specific inquiry, and it has to be, and here I'm aligning with Susan and with Catherine McKinnon and others who say the point is not offensiveness, it's harm. If you can't show harm, there really shouldn't be any conversation about whether or not things can be regulated. So I wouldn't say that there was a rule or a regulation that I would support that would sort of preemptively say these are the things you cannot say. Merely that if there were a theory of action that would be otherwise valid if we weren't talking about the internet, that is, if you think, for instance, about the recent Dominion versus Fox case, right? Think about what that case is about. Dominion says, you defamed us, right? Fox News says, well, it wasn't us, it was our guests. Well, guess what? The court says, well, that's still you. Yeah. And you knew what they were going to say, and you profited from it. And the rule there was, look, you may or may not ultimately be found liable for defamation, right? It didn't get to the merits ultimately. But the court says, this can proceed. When Fox News tried to basically say, it wasn't us, it was the people we invited, it was the people on our premises, the answer was, that is not a defense. You still have to show up in court and defend yourself. The question is, why does the tech industry get it differently? That Fox.com would be able to defend itself that way when Fox News could not.
You're all invited to a reception outside, but first let's thank Dr. Franks for this wonderful lecture.